"Step back or I'll fire a warning shot," I shouted, my voice cutting across the crisp mountain air as three men in crisp HOA jackets advanced toward the weathered wooden gate. Their approach was deliberate, almost theatrical. They carried clipboards, shoulder-mounted cameras, and a compliance notice printed in glaring red ink that made my stomach twist. I planted myself on the cracked dirt ground, gripping a heavy rifle, the cold metal biting into my palms, sending sharp chills down my spine. I didn't flinch. I wouldn't. This wasn't the first time anyone had tried to take what belonged to my family. And last time, it hadn't ended peacefully. These men thought this was just a routine inspection, a simple intimidation attempt. Maybe they should have asked the ones who had come before and never returned. Behind that gate, there were secrets no HOA bylaw should ever touch. And the deeper truth? You only really understand it if you know how it all started. Music. 3 weeks earlier, I was buried in work at my Denver architecture office, surrounded by sterile sketches of soulless suburban developments, when the call came. Uncle Frank was dead. 72 years old, heart attack, alone in his cabin by Pine Ridge Lake, exactly the way he had lived for 3 decades. Frank Mallister had been my father's older brother, a Vietnam veteran who had returned home to a world that didn't care about his sacrifice. While other kids vacationed at Disney World or spent summers at amusement parks, I spent mine learning to fish, hunt, and shoot with Uncle Frank. He taught me the most important lesson of my life. Sometimes a man has to stand his ground, no matter how many forces come against him. The lawyer's office smelled of old leather and stale ambition. Attorney Peterson, thin and wire-rimmed, shuffled papers like he was reading a grocery list. "The property consists of 15 acres on Pine Ridge. Lake," he droned, "including the main cabin, outbuildings, and all mineral rights." He paused and peered at me over his glasses, offering a look that might have been sympathy. "However, there's an unusual clause in your uncle's will. The ranch cannot be sold or transferred under any circumstances. Any violation voids the inheritance entirely." Peterson leaned in, voice lowering, almost conspiratorial. "I should mention, Mr. Mallister, that inquiries have already been made about this clause. Multiple times, in fact. The drive to Pine Ridge was long, 4 hours of winding mountain roads, each mile feeling like it led further from civilization. And then, finally, I saw the cabin. My breath caught. It wasn't the dilapidated shack I'd half expected after 30 years of isolation. No, it stood solid and proud, the logs weathered but unwavering, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. Behind it, Pine Ridge Lake mirrored the sky, crystal clear and peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt something like peace. But peace, I quickly realized, was a luxury I couldn't afford. Across the lake, neighboring houses glinted like polished monuments to wealth, modern glass and steel structures that looked like they had been airlifted straight from a Beverly Hills catalog. Signs reading, "Pine Ridge Community, HOA managed," dotted the shoreline like markers of territorial pride. Uncle Frank's rare letters suddenly made sense. Letters filled with disdain for these same neighbors, full of warnings and subtle rage. Trouble revealed itself sooner than expected. Walking the property line, I saw orange metal stakes hammered into the ground every 50 feet, each marked HOA survey marker, "Do not remove." They cut through what should have been my land, slicing away at the waterfront access by at least a third. Fresh paint glinted in the sun, soil still loose. Someone had been busy since Uncle Frank's funeral. My anger surged. The first stake came out with a shriek of metal against stone. Subsequent stakes yielded more easily, as if each one amplified my resolve. Back at the cabin, I combed through Uncle Frank's belongings, searching for clues about the stakes, the inquiries, or the unsettling sensation of being watched from across the water. In a drawer beneath old hunting magazines and ammunition receipts, I found a manila envelope sealed with red wax. My name was scrawled across it in Frank's precise handwriting. The instructions beneath made my blood run cold. Open when the HOA comes calling. Inside, a letter dated 6 months prior awaited me. Written in the same hand that had taught me to sign my name as a boy, it read, "Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone and they're making their move. They've wanted this land for 20 years, ever since they built those glass houses across the lake. Trust no one outside the family. And whatever you do, check the dog statue by the gate. Some things are better seen than heard." At the bottom, Frank had sketched a small rifle with the words, "Sometimes you have to make them listen." I was still staring at the letter when the doorbell rang, a sound so unexpected in this isolated place that it might as well have been a gunshot. Through the window, I saw a woman standing at the gate, elegant, middle-aged, holding a thick folder of documents. Her smile was polished, too perfect, the kind politicians practice in front of mirrors. When I opened the door, she stepped forward with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. "Ethan," she said, extending a manicured hand, "I'm Claire Whitmore. I know this must be a shock, but I'm your half-sister. Same father, different mother. It's time we talked about our inheritance." Claire Whitmore radiated money and influence. Perfectly styled auburn hair, Italian leather briefcase, the air of someone born to command. She claimed to be 47, seeking family ties since our father's death 15 years ago. DNA test results, official letterhead, genetic markers, they all seemed legitimate. Her birth certificate, though yellowed, looked authentic. Yet her eyes held a subtle misalignment, with the warmth of her smile. Uncle Frank's warning echoed in my mind. Trust no one outside the family. She settled into Frank's leather chair, spreading documents across the coffee table like a seasoned strategist. "I know this is overwhelming, Ethan," she said, voice smooth with concern. "But I've been following the HOA's legal maneuvers, and frankly, I'm worried for both of us. According to Claire, the Pine Ridge HOA had coveted this land for decades, waiting for Uncle Frank to die so they could seize it. They had already approached her, offering millions to secure any potential claims. 2 $8 million checks, split evenly. Instead of rejecting her outright, I played along. Her story felt rehearsed, polished, too perfect. I asked her to bring a detailed contract so I could review it with my attorney, all the while plotting my next move. If Claire was colluding with the HOA, I needed proof. That evening, I set up a small trap, a hidden recorder beneath the coffee table, a camera behind the bookshelf, both purchased from a local electronics store. If she had nothing to hide, great. But if she did, I would know. The next morning, I tailed Claire to a small cafe in Pine Ridge Village. There, she met a striking woman in her 50s who radiated authority. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing around cautiously. I stationed myself nearby, hidden behind a newspaper, using a directional microphone app to capture fragments. "He's suspicious, Margot," Claire said, stirring her coffee nervously. "I can see it in his eyes. He's not the pushover we expected." Margot leaned forward, predatory, cultured, cold, commanding. "Then we moved to Plan B," she replied. "Make him think you're a victim too. Tell him the HOA is threatening you. Make him feel needed. Men love playing protector, especially with family." Claire nodded, eager. "And if that doesn't work?" Margot's smile was razor-sharp. "Then we remind Mr. Mallister that there are other ways to acquire property when legal methods fail." I followed Margot to her car after the meeting, noting the license plate and the business card holder visible through her window. The name on the cards read Margot Vance and Associates Legal Consulting, which explained the predatory confidence. As she drove away in her black Mercedes, I photographed everything I could, building a file on the woman who was clearly the power behind Claire's sudden appearance in my life. This wasn't a family reunion. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a homecoming. That evening, Claire returned with a briefcase full of contracts and a story that was pure theater. She claimed the HOA had contacted her that afternoon, threatening to challenge both our inheritance claims in court unless we agreed to sell immediately. Tears welled in her eyes as she described how frightened she was, how she'd never dealt with anything like this before. She begged me to consider the sale, not for the money, but for our mutual protection against the HOA's legal machine. It was a masterful performance, and it might have worked if I hadn't heard her rehearsing it with Margot just hours earlier. I played my part perfectly, expressing concern for her safety and agreeing that we needed to stick together as a family. I even went so far as to suggest we meet again the next evening to finalize our decision. Claire left that night convinced she had me exactly where she wanted me. She was half right. I had made a decision, but it wasn't the one she expected. As I watched her taillights disappear down the mountain road, I wondered how many other families had fallen for this same elaborate con game. Later that night, I was awakened by sounds outside the cabin. Looking through the window, I saw flashlight beams moving around the property, but when I stepped outside to investigate, whoever had been there was gone. The only evidence of their visit was that Uncle Frank's old concrete dog statue by the gate had been moved slightly from its original position. Remembering Frank's letter about checking the dog statue, I decided it was time to see what secrets my uncle had been trying to share from beyond the grave. The morning sun was barely peeking through the pines when I decided to investigate Uncle Frank's cryptic message about the dog statue. The concrete German Shepherd had been guarding the gate for as long as I could remember, weathered and chipped, but somehow dignified in its eternal watch. As I examined it more closely, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small seam running along the base, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. When I pressed against it, a hidden compartment clicked open, revealing a cavity just large enough to hold a small device. Inside was a tiny camera, no bigger than a matchbox, along with a wireless transmitter and what appeared to be a high-capacity memory card. The metadata on the device told a disturbing story. The camera had been recording for 2 weeks, capturing everyone who approached the property. But more troubling was the wireless signal information. It had been transmitting data to an IP address registered to Outraged Community Management. Someone had been watching my every move since before I'd even inherited the place. They'd seen me remove the survey stakes, witnessed my meetings with Claire, and probably knew about my late-night photography of Margot Vance. That violation felt personal, like discovering someone had been reading my diary. Instead of destroying the camera immediately, I decided to turn Uncle Frank's paranoia into my advantage. I repositioned the device so it would still appear functional while installing my own camera system in hidden locations around the property. If the HOA wanted surveillance footage, I'd give them a show worth watching. I spent the morning performing for their hidden camera, acting nervous and defeated. I paced around the cabin, talking to myself about how scared I was of legal battles and how maybe selling was the smart choice after all. I even staged a fake phone call to a fictional attorney, expressing my willingness to accept any reasonable offer to avoid a court fight. My performance was interrupted that afternoon when 3 men in matching HOA polo shirts arrived at the gate. They carried official-looking clipboards and introduced themselves as property compliance officers, though their badges looked like they'd been printed at a local copy shop. The lead inspector, a heavy-set man named Williams, spoke with the authority of someone who'd never been challenged. "Mr. Mallister, we've received reports of code violations on this property," he announced, consulting his clipboard with theatrical seriousness. "Unauthorized removal of survey markers, improper vegetation maintenance, and evidence of prohibited pet ownership." I almost laughed at the last charge. Uncle Frank's old hunting dog had died 3 years ago. When Williams demanded access to the property for a comprehensive inspection, I knew it was time to make my stand. I disappeared into the cabin and returned with Uncle Frank's Winchester. 0-06. The same rifle he taught me to shoot with when I was 12. The weight of it in my hands brought back memories of summer afternoons spent learning to respect both the weapon and the responsibility it represented. "Gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice steady, and the rifle pointed safely toward the ground. "This is private property. Unless you have a warrant, you're trespassing." The effect was immediate and satisfying. William's face went pale, and his two companions took several steps backward. "Sir, there's no need for weapons," William stammered, his earlier authority evaporating like morning mist. "We're just trying to do our jobs." I pulled out my phone and started a Facebook live stream, making sure the camera captured both the HO officials and their obvious discomfort. "Ladies and gentlemen," I addressed my growing online audience, "I'd like you to meet the Penerage HOA compliance team. They've been illegally surveilling my property and are now demanding access without a warrant." The viewer count was climbing rapidly, and comments were pouring in from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. While maintaining the live stream, I walked over to the dog statue and dramatically removed the hidden camera, holding it up for my online audience to see. "This device has been recording my private activities for weeks and transmitting the data to the HOA without my knowledge or consent," I explained to the camera. "I'd call that stalking, wouldn't you?" The comment section exploded with outrage and legal advice from viewers who'd clearly dealt with similar situations. Williams and his team were backing toward their vehicles, but I wasn't finished with them yet. "Before you leave, Williams, why don't you call your boss and tell her the show didn't go as planned?" I said, still broadcasting live. "Tell Margot Vance that her little surveillance operation just became public knowledge." The look of shock on Williams' face confirmed what I'd suspected. He hadn't expected me to know about Margot or her involvement in the scheme. One of his companions was already on his phone, and I could hear him saying, "Margot, we have a problem. He knows about the cameras, and he's got some kind of rifle." After the HOA team departed in obvious haste, I ended the live stream and checked the results. The video had been shared over 300 times in just 30 minutes, with comments ranging from legal advice to offers of support from fellow property owners who'd battled their own HOA disputes. But their real victory was in what I'd overheard during Williams' phone call. Now I had confirmation that Margot Vance was directly involved in the surveillance operation, which meant I could potentially file criminal charges for invasion of privacy. That evening brought an unexpected consequence of my newfound internet fame. Penerage County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the cabin with a complaint filed by Williams about threatening behavior with a deadly weapon. The deputies were professional, but clearly uncomfortable with the situation, especially after I showed them the hidden camera and explained about the illegal surveillance. Officer Martinez, the senior deputy, examined the device with obvious interest. "Mr. Mallister, you're within your rights to protect your property, but we have to investigate the complaint," he said diplomatically. "However, I'd suggest you document everything and consider filing your own charges for the surveillance violations." As the deputies left, one of them mentioned that my video had already reached their department through social media and that several residents had called to report similar experiences with Penerage HOA. It seemed my little rebellion was inspiring others to speak up about their own troubles with the organization. But as satisfying as that was, I knew the real battle was just beginning. Margot Vance had shown her hand, but she was far from finished with her attempts to acquire Uncle Frank's land. Late that night, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a disguised voice delivered a message that sent chills down my spine. "You think you're smart, don't you, Mallister? We have other ways of getting what we want. Tomorrow night, you'll understand just how serious we are about this property." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the dark lake and wondering what new horror Margot Vance was planning. The anonymous threat proved prophetic. At exactly 2 in the morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of heavy machinery echoing across the lake. I'd been expecting something like this since the phone call, so I'd prepared accordingly. Earlier that evening, I'd installed infrared cameras at strategic points around the property and charged my drone with its 4 Kelvin camera attachment. Uncle Frank's military training had rubbed off on me over the years, and he'd always said the best defense was knowing what your enemy was planning before they knew you knew. Through my bedroom window, I could see a convoy of vehicles parked along the far edge of my property line. Floodlights on telescoping poles were being erected in the field behind the cabin, casting harsh white light across what should have been darkness. Men in matching Pine Ridge development uniforms were moving with practice efficiency, setting up what looked like a temporary survey station. They were working fast, clearly hoping to complete whatever they were doing before dawn brought potential witnesses. I activated my drone and sent it on a reconnaissance flight, keeping it high enough to avoid detection while its camera captured everything in high-definition detail. What I saw through the live feed made my blood boil. They weren't just surveying, they were actively redrawing the property boundaries. New stakes were being driven into the ground in a line that would effectively reduce my lakefront access by nearly 40%. According to their new markers, the prime waterfront area where Uncle Frank used to keep his boat dock would belong to the HOA community. But I had learned a few tricks during my years designing security systems for commercial buildings. Instead of confronting them directly, I decided to sow confusion in their ranks. Using a voice modulation app on my phone, I created fake radio communications that mimicked their supervisor's voice. Team Alpha, abort current operation, and Moveto Sector 7. I broadcast on their radio frequency. We've got potential law enforcement en route. The effect was immediate chaos as different crew members received conflicting orders, some continuing their work while others began packing equipment. The confusion bought me enough time to position additional cameras for optimal coverage and to start a new live stream, this one titled HOA Caught Red-Handed in Midnight Land Grab. Within minutes of going live, viewers from across the country were watching the Pine Ridge development crew stumble around in the darkness, clearly unsure of their orders. The comment section was filled with outrage and legal advice, with several viewers claiming to be attorneys offering to help Pruno if I decided to pursue legal action. My drone captured the perfect money shot when one of the workers answered his radio and said, "Boss, there's some confusion here. Johnson says we're supposed to finish the perimeter, but William says we should pack up and move to the backup location." The voice that responded was clearly Margot Vance, though she was trying to disguise it. "Just get those damn stakes in the ground and get out of there. We're running out of time." The live stream viewers went wild, with someone immediately running the audio through voice analysis software and confirming it matched previous recordings of Margot from public HOA meetings. 20 minutes later, when it became clear that their operation was falling apart, I decided to make my presence known. I stepped out onto the cabin's front porch, Winchester in hand, and fired 2 warning shots into the air. The sound echoed across the lake like thunder, and the effect on the development crew was immediate and satisfying. Floodlights went dark, equipment was abandoned, and vehicle engines roared to life as the entire operation collapsed into retreat. Through my drone's camera, I watched them flee like teenagers caught vandalizing a school. But they left behind more than just confusion. In their haste to escape, several crew members dropped equipment and documents. Among the abandoned items I found, surveying equipment worth thousands of dollars, all bearing Vance Construction and Development logos. More importantly, I discovered a detailed site plan showing not just my property but the entire Pinerage area, with phases marked for a massive development project that would transform the entire lakefront into a luxury resort complex. The document was a treasure trove of information. Phase 1 involved acquiring the Mallister property through legal manipulation. Phase 2 called for filing false environmental hazard claims to force government intervention. Phase 3 was labeled emergency acquisition via municipal authority. which sounded ominously like using eminent domain to steal people's homes for private profit. At the bottom of the plans was a projected revenue figure that made my head spin: $500 million in total development value. As I examined the documents more closely, I found something that made the whole picture even clearer. The development plans weren't just signed by Margot Vance as HOA president. They were also signed by Margot Vance as CEO of Vance Construction and Development Corporation. She wasn't just representing the Homeowners Association, she was using the HOA as a front for her own massive real estate scheme. The conflict of interest was so blatant that even a first-year law student could have spotted it from orbit. My live stream was still running, and I made sure to show every document to my online audience while carefully avoiding any information that might compromise a future legal case. By dawn, the video had been viewed over 50,000 times and shared across multiple social media platforms. Local news stations were already calling, requesting interviews about the Pine Ridge land grab scandal. Margot Vance's carefully orchestrated plan was crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. But success brought new dangers. That morning, as I was reviewing the night's footage and preparing to contact attorneys, a white delivery truck pulled up to my gate. The driver, a nervous-looking man in his 30s, unloaded a large metal container marked HOA building materials and placed it just outside my property line before speeding away without explanation. The container was sealed with heavy-duty locks and bore multiple warning labels about hazardous contents and authorized personnel only. Something about the container's placement and timing felt wrong. It was too convenient, too obviously bait for whatever trap Margot was setting next. But it was also evidence of something, and my lawyer's advice from the previous evening echoed in my mind. Document everything, assume nothing, and always have witnesses. I photographed the container from multiple angles and called Attorney Peterson to ask about the legality of opening what might be evidence of another crime. His advice was clear. If I suspected the container posed an immediate threat to public safety, I had the right to investigate, especially with proper documentation and witnesses present. ASI prepared to call the authorities about the mysterious container. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check the container, Mr. Mallister. You'll find it very educational. But remember, some lessons come with consequences." The message was unsigned, but I had little doubt about who had sent it. Margot Vance was escalating the game, and I was about to learn just how far she was willing to go to get Uncle Frank's land. Attorney Peterson's legal advice was crystal clear. If I had reasonable suspicion that the container posed an immediate public safety threat, I could legally investigate its contents, provided I documented everything and had witnesses present. That's exactly what I did. I called Peterson himself, asking him to drive out to the property, and started another Facebook live stream before approaching the container. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced to my growing online audience, "we're about to discover what Margot Vance and the Pine Ridge HOA consider building materials." The viewer count was climbing rapidly, with people sharing the stream faster than I could read the comments. The container's locks were heavy-duty, but bolt cutters from Uncle Frank's tool shed made quick work of them. With Peterson standing beside me as a legal witness and hundreds of people watching online, I opened the metal doors to reveal contents that made my stomach turn. Inside were sophisticated radiation detection devices, soil sampling equipment, and several containers of what appeared to be radioactive material, all bearing fake government inspection seals. But the real smoking gun was a stack of pre-printed environmental hazard reports, complete with official letterhead and spaces left blank for dates and signatures. The documents revealed a plan so cynical, it took my breath away. According to the paperwork, Vance Construction intended to contaminate my property with low-level radioactive material, then use their own detection equipment to discover the contamination. They would then file emergency environmental reports with the county, claiming the land posed a public health risk and required immediate government intervention. Once the property was condemned and seized under environmental protection laws, Vance Construction would swoop in with a remediation contract, and somehow the land would end up clean and ready for development. Peterson was photographing everything while maintaining a running commentary for the legal record. "This appears to be a conspiracy to commit environmental fraud and potentially terrorism," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The use of radioactive material to contaminate private property constitutes multiple federal crimes." The live stream comments were exploding with outrage and disbelief, with several viewers claiming to be federal agents and promising to forward the footage to appropriate authorities. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. At the bottom of the container, beneath all the equipment and fake documents, I found detailed architectural plans for Outraged luxury resort and spa. The project wasn't just about my 15 acres. It was a massive development spanning hundreds of acres around the entire lake. Property after property was marked for acquisition, with my uncle's land serving as the crucial waterfront centerpiece. The projected revenue figures made my earlier discovery look modest. This was a billion-dollar development scheme disguised as homeowners association management. What truly sickened me was realizing how many families would be destroyed by this plan. The documents included psychological profiles of property owners, identifying which ones could be bought off, which ones could be intimidated, and which ones would require special measures for removal. Uncle Frank's file was marked deceased, nephew vulnerable to financial pressure. My own profile described me as city professional, likely to accept reasonable settlement to avoid legal complications. They had studied us like lab rats, mapping out our weaknesses and planning our destruction with clinical precision. As I was explaining these discoveries to my online audience, my phone rang with a call that changed everything. The caller ID showed a Denver number I recognized, my old college roommate, Mike Granger. Mike's voice was tight with emotion as he explained why he was calling. "Ethan, I've been following your videos online. 3 years ago, my family lost our house in Colorado Springs to the same scheme. A company called Vance Development used fake environmental reports to force the city to condemn our property. We lost everything and never understood how it happened until I saw your stream tonight." Mike's story filled in the missing pieces of Margot Vance's operation. She had been running this scam across multiple states, using different shell companies and corrupt officials to steal properties for development. Mike's family had been just one of dozens of victims, all of them convinced they were facing legitimate environmental emergencies until it was too late to fight back. "Ethan, this isn't just about your uncle's land," Mike said, his voice breaking with emotion. "This woman has destroyed lives across the entire region. We have to stop her before she does it to anyone else." The personal connection transformed my anger into something more focused and determined. This wasn't just about preserving Uncle Frank's legacy anymore. It was about protecting every family that Margot Vance might target in the future. I made a promise to Mike and to my thousands of online viewers that we would expose this conspiracy completely, no matter what it cost. The fight had become bigger than just me versus the HOA. It was now about justice for everyone who had been victimized by this elaborate criminal enterprise. But Margot wasn't finished with her surprises. As Peterson and I were finishing our documentation of the container's contents, 3 police cars arrived at the property with sirens blazing. The lead officer, Detective Harrison, emerged with an arrest warrant bearing my name. "Mr. Mallister, you're under arrest for threatening public officials with a deadly weapon and destruction of private property," he announced, apparently referring to my confrontation with the HOA compliance team and the survey stakes I'd removed. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Somehow, Margot had managed to get criminal charges filed against me just as I was exposing her environmental fraud scheme. But I wasn't the same naive city architect who had inherited this property weeks ago. I had learned to think like Uncle Frank, always staying one step ahead of the enemy. "Detective Harrison," I said calmly, still broadcasting live to my audience, "before you arrest me, you might want to look at the evidence of federal crimes we've just uncovered. I believe conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism trumps misdemeanor property disputes. Peterson immediately stepped forward with his legal credentials, explaining the situation to Detective Harrison. While my live stream audience served as witnesses to everything, the detective found himself in an awkward position. He had a valid arrest warrant, but he was also looking at evidence of what appeared to be a massive federal conspiracy. The comments on my stream were filled with people claiming to have already contacted the FBI, State Attorney General's office, and environmental protection agencies about what they had witnessed. That night, I found myself in a Outraged County jail cell. But I wasn't alone in my fight anymore. My arrest had been broadcast live to over 500,000 viewers, and the story was already being picked up by national news outlets. Social media was buzzing with number justice for Malister hashtags and demands for investigation into the Outraged HOA scandal. What Margot had intended as a knockout blow had instead transformed my local property dispute into a national cause célèbre. As I sat in that cell, I couldn't help but think about Uncle Frank and the lessons he taught me about standing up to bullies. He had always said that sometimes the only way to defeat a powerful enemy was to make their strength work against them. Margot Vance had used her influence to have me arrested. But in doing so, she had given me something more valuable than freedom. She had given me a platform and a story that people across the country could understand and support. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I might actually win. The Outraged County Jail wasn't exactly a 5-star hotel, but it gave me time to think about Uncle Frank's final lesson. He had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else, a habit that had kept him alive in Vietnam and served him well during 30 years of fighting the HOA's encroachment attempts. As I sat in that cell, I began to understand that my arrest wasn't a setback. It was exactly what Frank had been preparing for all along. The old soldier had been playing the long game, and I was just now beginning to see the full scope of his strategy. Mike Granger arrived the next morning with a lawyer I'd never met, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in federal corruption cases. But more importantly, Mike brought something that made my heart race. Uncle Frank's brown leather notebook, the one I'd somehow overlooked during my searches of the cabin. I found this hidden behind a false panel in his bedroom closet, Mike explained. There's a note inside saying to give it to you if you ever get arrested for defending the property. The notebook was thick with 20 years of meticulous documentation, and as I flipped through its pages, I realized that Uncle Frank had been building a case against Margot Vance since before I even knew she existed. The notebook was a masterpiece of investigative work. Frank had documented every interaction with the HOA, every suspicious coincidence, every attempt at intimidation or manipulation. He had photographs of midnight survey operations dating back to 2018, recordings of HOA board meetings where Margot discussed problem properties, and most importantly, it detailed financial records showing how Vance Construction had been systematically acquiring lakefront properties through the same environmental fraud scheme that had destroyed Mike's family. But the real treasure was buried in the notebook's final pages, a complete network diagram showing Margot's connections to corrupt officials throughout the state. According to Frank's research, Margot had been paying bribes to County Commissioner Thomas Brennan for over a decade. Brennan had used his position to fast-track environmental condemnations and property seizures, always ensuring that Vance Construction received the lucrative remediation contracts. But Frank had gone deeper than just documenting the corruption. He had been recording it. Hidden throughout the property were miniature recording devices, so small and well camouflaged that even I hadn't noticed them during my weeks at the cabin. Frank had captured years of conversations between Margot and her co-conspirators, all of them admitting to crimes that would put them away for decades. The notebook revealed something even more shocking. Claire Whitmore wasn't just a hired actress playing my long-lost sister. She was Thomas Brennan's former mistress and had been feeding information about property owners to the Vance organization for years. The DNA test she'd shown me was completely fabricated, created by a corrupt lab technician who was also on Vance's payroll. Claire had been part of dozens of similar schemes, always playing the role of the concerned family member who just wanted to help resolve complicated inheritance situations. She was a professional con artist, and I had been just another mark in her long career of destroying families. Attorney Chen was photographing every page of the notebook while explaining the legal implications. "This evidence could bring down the entire network," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "We're not just talking about property fraud anymore. This is racketeering, bribery, conspiracy, and potentially dozens of federal crimes. With this documentation, we can demand a full FBI investigation and probably get most of your uncle's recordings admitted as evidence." Their recordings were stored on micro SD cards, hidden in various locations around the property, each one labeled with dates and locations in Frank's careful handwriting. But Uncle Frank's final surprise was yet to come. Hidden in the notebook's back cover was a business card for Judge William Harrison, a federal judge who had recently retired from the Colorado District Court. A handwritten note from Frank explained that Judge Harrison had been approached by Margot Vance years ago with an offer to fix cases in exchange for payment. Unlike the other officials who had taken her money, Harrison had reported the attempted bribery to federal authorities and had been quietly cooperating with an ongoing investigation ever since. Frank had been in contact with Harrison for 3 years, feeding him information about Vance's activities and building a comprehensive case for federal prosecution. The timing of my arrest suddenly made perfect sense. Margot hadn't just been trying to silence me. She had been trying to prevent me from discovering Frank's evidence before she could retrieve and destroy it. But her plan had backfired spectacularly by having me arrested. She had triggered the very sequence of events that Frank had been preparing for ensuring that his evidence would reach the right people at exactly the right moment. My uncle had turned my arrest into the final piece of his 20-year puzzle, a master stroke that would bring down the entire criminal enterprise. Within hours of Attorney Chen reviewing the notebook, federal agents were swarming the Pine Ridge area. The FBI had been building its own case against Vance Construction for years, but it had lacked the crucial evidence that Frank's recordings provided. Agent Thompson, the lead investigator, explained that they had been waiting for exactly this kind of breakthrough. "Your uncle's documentation fills in gaps we've had in our investigation for years," he said. "We now have enough evidence to file federal charges against the entire organization, from Margot Vance all the way down to the local officials who took her bribes. The arrest warrants came down like dominoes." Thomas Brennan was arrested at his office while destroying documents that might have implicated him further. Claire Whitmore was picked up ATA Denver, hotel where she had been preparing to flee the state with a suitcase full of cash and multiple fake identities, and Margot Vance herself was arrested during an emergency HOA board meeting where she was reportedly screaming at her associates about containing the situation and eliminating the problem permanently. But Margot's arrest came with one final twist that chilled me to the bone. Federal agents had been monitoring her communications, and they had intercepted messages about something called Plan Z, a contingency that involved burning down my cabin, with me inside it, making my death look like an accident caused by faulty electrical wiring. The plan had been scheduled for that very evening, and only my arrest had prevented Margot from implementing what amounted to a murder plot designed to cover up her crimes. The media circus that followed was unlike anything Piney-Ridge County had ever seen. National news crews descended on the small mountain community, turning the HOA scandal into a cautionary tale about corruption and the abuse of local authority. My live streams had provided the initial spark, but Uncle Frank's meticulous documentation had given federal prosecutors everything they needed to dismantle one of the largest property fraud schemes in Colorado history. The story was being covered by everyone from local newspapers to major network news programs, with my uncle being posthumously hailed as a hero who had spent 20 years fighting for justice. As I was finally released from jail pending the resolution of charges that everyone now knew would be dropped, I stood outside the Piney County Courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters. Mike Granger was there along with dozens of other Vance construction victims who had driven from across the region to see justice finally being served. Attorney Chan explained that the evidence Uncle Frank had gathered would not only exonerate me completely, but would likely result in massive financial settlements for everyone who had been victimized by the scheme. That night, as I returned to the cabin for the first time since my arrest, I found a final message from Uncle Frank that I had somehow missed before. Pinned to the refrigerator was a note in his handwriting that simply said, "Ethan, if you're reading this, then the bastards finally made their move and you handled it just like I knew you would. The land is safe. The truth is out, and justice is coming. Welcome home, soldier." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I could finally breathe freely, knowing that Uncle Frank's 20-year war was finally over. 3 months later, I stood in the same spot where I'd first confronted the HOA compliance team, but everything had changed. The federal courthouse in Denver was packed with reporters, victims, and supporters. As the final chapter of the Piney scandal played out before a national audience, Margot Vance, once the powerful CEO who had terrorized property owners across multiple states, now sat in an orange jumpsuit as prosecutors laid out the full scope of her crimes. The evidence Uncle Frank had spent 20 years collecting was being presented piece by piece, each recording and document another nail in the coffin of her criminal enterprise. The trial had become a media sensation with court television, providing gavel-toga-villa coverage and social media buzzing with updates about what pundits were calling the HOA scandal that broke the internet. My original live streams had been viewed millions of times, turning me into an unlikely folk hero for property rights advocates across the country. But the real hero of this story was Uncle Frank, whose posthumous testimony through his meticulous records was dismantling one of the most sophisticated property fraud schemes in American history. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the proceedings, with the stern efficiency of someone who had seen every kind of corruption case imaginable. As I took the witness stand, I carried Uncle Frank's brown notebook and the flash drive containing his hidden recordings. Mr. Mallister, Prosecutor Janet Stevens began, "Please tell the court about your uncle's final message to you." I read Frank's last note aloud, the one that had welcomed me home as a soldier, and I could see several jurors wiping away tears as they understood the sacrifice he had made to protect not just his land, but the rights of every property owner who might face similar predators. Margot's defense attorney tried to paint her as a legitimate businesswoman who had been misled by subordinates. But Uncle Frank's recordings destroyed that narrative completely. The jury listened to her own voice, ordering environmental contamination, discussing bribery payments, and even approving the Plan Z that would have cost me my life. When the prosecution played the recording where she discussed eliminating the Mallister problem permanently, I watched Margot's face crumble as she realized her own words were sealing her fate. The parade of victims who testified was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Mike Granger took the stand to describe how his family had lost everything to Vance Construction's fake environmental reports. An elderly couple from Grand Junction explained how they'd been forced from the home where they'd raised 4 children after Margot's organization claimed their well water was contaminated. A young military veteran described losing his disability-accessible home to what he now knew was a completely fabricated chemical spill report. Each story followed the same pattern: fake environmental emergencies, rushed condemnation proceedings, and property transfers that somehow always benefited Vance Construction. Claire Whitmore had already pleaded guilty and was serving as a prosecution witness, her testimony revealing the shocking scope of the identity theft and fraud that had supported Margot's operations. She admitted to impersonating family members in over 30 different property acquisition schemes, each one supported by fabricated DNA tests and forged documents. When asked why she had targeted me specifically, Claire's answer was chillingly simple: Margot said city people were easier marks because they didn't understand rural property laws and were more likely to settle quickly. Thomas Brennan's corruption was laid bare through bank records and recorded conversations that showed a systematic pattern of bribery spanning more than a decade. The former county commissioner had received over $2 million in payments from Vance construction money that had been disguised as consulting fees and real estate investments. His testimony, given in exchange for a reduced sentence, revealed that Margot had similar arrangements with officials in 6 different counties, creating a network of corruption that had enabled hundreds of illegal property seizures. But the most damning evidence came from Margot's own communications intercepted by federal agents in the weeks before her arrest. In a series of text messages and phone calls, she had ordered the escalation to Plan Z when it became clear that legal methods weren't working. The plan involved not just burning down my cabin, but making it appear that I had died accidentally, while trying to destroy evidence of environmental contamination. Federal arson investigators testified that accelerants had already been positioned around the cabin's foundation, and that only my arrest had prevented what would have been first-degree murder. The sentencing phase brought a kind of closure that Uncle Frank never lived to see. Judge Williams imposed the maximum penalty under federal racketeering statutes. Margot Vance received 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Thomas Brennan got 12 years for his role in the conspiracy. Claire Whitmore, in exchange for her cooperation, received 7 years but would be eligible for parole in 3. The financial penalties were equally devastating. Vance Construction was ordered to pay over $200 million in restitution to victims, and Margot's personal assets were seized to help fund the payments. As I walked out of the courthouse that final day, I was surrounded by reporters asking about my plans for the future. The answer was simple. I was going home to Pine Ridge, where Uncle Frank's cabin would become exactly what he had always envisioned. The Mallister Veterans Retreat was already under construction, a place where military veterans could find the peace and healing that my uncle had discovered beside that beautiful mountain lake. Mike Granger had moved to Pine Ridge to help run the center, and together we were creating something that honored both Frank's memory and his lifelong fight for justice. The old Pine Ridge HOA had been dissolved and replaced with a community organization, focused on actual homeowner services rather than property acquisition schemes. Many of Margot's victims had received substantial settlements that allowed them to rebuild their lives, and several had chosen to relocate to the Pine Ridge area, drawn by the sense of community that had emerged from our shared struggle against corruption. Standing on the cabin's porch that evening, looking out over the lake where it all began, I could almost hear Uncle Frank's voice in the wind through the pines. The Winchester still hung over the fireplace. But now it was a symbol of victory rather than defiance. On the mantel beside it sat his brown notebook, open to the page where he had written his final message. Sometimes you have to make them listen. Below that, I had added my own words. And sometimes justice takes 20 years, but it always comes. The land was safe. The truth was known, and Uncle Frank could finally rest in peace. My friends, Uncle Frank taught me that sometimes one person standing up can change everything. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why we fight for what's right, please hit that like button and subscribe to Harper Stories. There are more battles out there, more neighbors who need our support against those who abuse power. Together, we're not just sharing stories. We're building a community that refuses to let the powerful crush the innocent. Stand with us. Your voice matters.